Welcome to the Austin Public Library podcast. My name is Julie Kleinfelter, Director of the Public Library in Austin, Minnesota, and I'm here with my co-host, Michael Verde, for the sixth podcast of our Reading for Life program. Reading for Life is a movement of the imagination for the purpose of growing community around a shared love of literature. Structured like a book group, but one facilitated to maintain the richest possible dialogue among the participants and the source text, the presentations bridge great novels to dedicated readers. The idea is that real community begins and ends with our imaginations, and few resources, if any, are as vital to the imagination's development as works of literature. Our unofficial tagline for the program is 8 podcasts, 4 books, and you. Today, we are wrapping up The Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. Joining Michael and I today is Linda Hoffman, a local community member.
Well, good to see you, Linda. Good to see you, Julie.
Yeah.
Let's see if we can take this into some interesting places that we haven't gotten to before. So that's going to be my goal, that we push this into stuff that makes you think, wow, this is inexhaustible. So how about go ahead. You guys start something.
Great. I'll start. It seems that all 3 novels that we've discussed so far, To Kill a Mockingbird, Jane Eyre, and The Song of Solomon, have a common theme. And this all seems to keep feeding back to this idea of the connection. It's come up in all 3 books now, that idea of you don't want the hierarchy, you want that equal connection. And so I'm curious, Michael, is that just a common theme in a lot of these books, or did you pick these books specifically because they kind of all have a similar theme?
Okay, this is going to blow, maybe not your minds, but it blows some people's mind, that works of literature are not simply single, unique little entities that go off in a million different directions. All of these works of fiction ultimately are coming out of a common stream. It's a stream of consciousness that is attempting to recreate our fragmented world into a different kind of world. In other words, literature is not neutral. The reason this theme is coming up is because that's why it exists. It exists to quicken a mode of consciousness that will liberate us from the illusions of the ego. Now, that doesn't mean that every work of fiction is the same. Every work of fiction is uniquely what it is. But what it is part of a common consciousness. Okay, you can say this about human beings. Every one of us are unique, and yet we're also human. If we were not human, we wouldn't be uniquely human. We would be monsters. So I'm suggesting that every novel can be absolutely unique and still be coming from a very specific place of desire. These novels are expressing a kind of desire, and that desire is very much illustrated by the love that leads to bonding. This is why it comes up again and again. It wouldn't matter which novel we picked. I'm not saying we would always arrive here in the same way, because we would arrive here in different ways. Think of the difference between the Great Gatsby, Willie Lowe, Death of a Salesman, and this novel. They're all very, very different. So I'm not saying we keep talking about the same things, because they all get refracted through very, very particular sort of configurations. However, if we every time picked a random topic as if that whole point of that book was to talk about this one random topic, then the whole thing called literature we would not be able to grow a kind of knowledge. You see what I mean? If you study math, you learn math over here, you learn math over here, and guess what? You're learning something in common. You see what I mean? You're not just learning math in 5th grade, then learning math in college. You're learning something that, okay, so if you're going to have knowledge of math, it requires there to be something that it makes it unified. And I'm suggesting that literature has a unity to it that enables us, even though we read a bunch of different books, to also have a kind of accumulating awareness. You see what I mean? All of these books are in the service of trying to wake us up. This is why literature is very dangerous to tyrants. Why is it that dictators are more afraid of poets than scientists? because dictators aren't afraid of scientists, they're afraid of poets. Why are they afraid of poets? Because poets deal with a vision of the possible that is threatening to dictators. And I'm saying it's threatening even to our marketplace. If you've got an entire economy built on the idea that turn people into consumers, to fragment them from one another so that they feel insecure, and that the only way they can feel like secure again is to purchase these products, the last thing that you would want would be some kind of life force that was moving into people's imagination, that was leaving them feeling like their success in life had more to do with bonding with each other than it did to reach the top of the Empire State Building.
I have a question for you. As you're talking about this, I can't help thinking about, you're saying literature, and people write novels all the time.
Right.
And I personally wouldn't necessarily classify them all as looking to achieve what you're talking about, in particular, like Bridges of Madison County. You know about that book?
I've read it years ago, but I can faintly remember it.
The way the book was constructed, it was a product of market research, focus groups. The person who wrote it deliberately structured it to hit all the hot spots for women of a certain age range,
right,
who tend to be the ones who buy books. Now, to me, that's not an artist trying to raise people's consciousness. Wonderful. That's a person just trying to make a buck and having a very crafty way of doing it, right down to the design of the cover of the book.
Well, I think that's wonderful. And this is, I think, what it puts on the table, that in every novel, there is ideology. And what you just described in terms of marketing and taking what interest groups look for in terms of fantasies, those are symptoms of an ideology. So that in every novel, you'll find ideological elements. So we could take To Kill a Mockingbird, and you could say, look how this positions white people as the role of saviors. Look how this denigrates Black people, even when it's trying to show that it's not racist. In other words, you could take To Kill a Mockingbird and identify elements analogous to the ones that you identified regarding the marketplace. You can, in other words, the ideology speaks to an interest group, a social group, and gives them the illusion that their privilege is natural. Okay. So, all right. So in every novel, there's ideology, but here's the key thing. In order to generate ideologies have to draw from mythologies. Okay. Ideologies come out of mythologies. They're perverted mythologies. So even the Bridges of Madison County, there will be two layers to it. There will be the ideological layer that you just identified, but there will necessarily be, however unintendedly, a mythological dimension to it that is not a conscious effort to sell books. The very, for instance, metaphor of a bridge is exactly what bonding is like. You see, for ideologies to be impelling, for an ideology to move someone, it has to use a myth and it has to use a metaphor. And this is true for every dictator. A dictator has to use, think of what nationalism is, or white nationalism. It's a perverted mythology. It's a mythology that, yeah, we celebrate community, but look how it replicates a pyramid. So I'm suggesting every novel has both an ideological element, because an author has partly an ego consciousness and partly an imagination. And no matter how sort of expansive an author's imagination is, he or she still has an ego, and that ego does get some words in edgewise, and that ego is ideologically saturated. This is why every novel has to be read critically in the way you were reading the Bridges of Madison County. But if that's the only way we read a novel, look how much we would miss in Song of Solomon. Because beneath the ideological structure, these things related to guitars, fury over things like Emmett Till, which is all very important, there is also a mythology related to going down and finding in reality what you were looking for in the illusory world by going up. the gold in the cave and the wings at the top of the building, the colors red, white, and blue, all of these different things, those are elements of mythology. So I want to say that what you said is important, and say that every novel has an admixture of both of those things. And learning how to read is learning how partly to discern what is vital in the vision and what is the ego manipulating language for ideological ends. And they use two different parts of, you can say, of our intelligence. The part of intelligence that deconstructs the ideology of Bridges of Madison County is a kind of intellect that can dissect, which is very important. The other part of our psyche that enables us to understand things, and this is beautiful, is that what enables us to identify with. You see, to dissect something is to make it an object. The other part of our psyche wants to bond. And when it bonds with a novel, then it's not an object to be dissected in that way. And I'm suggesting that both of those modes of consciousness are critical to whatever we mean by freedom. We need both of those, right? We don't want to be so free that we can't marry each other. You know what I mean? If you were so liberated and so smart about every kind of manipulative agenda that everybody was just a con person and you couldn't trust anybody, I don't know how free you would be. You wouldn't even have the rest of your body. So then this is the point of Song of Solomon. You can't be free at all if you miss part of your body. If you think you're free from the neck up, you have a real shallow understanding of who you are. You can't be free without your body, and your body goes beyond your skin encapsulated ego. Your body includes those people's body. Your body includes that land. Your body includes those animals. Your body, and this is where it gets really interesting, includes language and a certain way of using language. And we can talk about that in just a second. But the point I'm trying to make is you can't be free, according to Song of Solomon, if you leave your body behind, which means you could never be free simply dissecting ideological manipulations, because that would be from the neck up. We still want to wed things, and yes, they're going to be imperfect things, but the only way to not be a part of imperfection, I suppose, is to be dead. So I'm saying that you could read Madison County in that way and it would be very insightful, but you could also read it and you would be able to discern the mythological sort of substrate from which that ideological agenda was working. It had to start from somewhere. And I'm just giving you an obvious example that bridges just on their nature suggest bonding or crossing differences. So even if you want to manipulate people, in other words, you have to use a myth that's going to deconstruct your manipulation.
Do you think that's a subconscious thing?
Well,
in an author who's writing fiction, they need to have their characters, and there needs to be a conflict and a resolution of the conflict, and in a sense that it's an organic kind of a thing that comes out of having to construct something like that?
These are amazing questions. One, I would say the imagination and the ego are two different things. So yes, it's subconscious to the ego, but to the imagination, it's very conscious. Okay, so that's number one. When we think about consciousness, what are we talking about? And I'm suggesting there's a difference between our workaday ego and an aspect of our psyche that is really not our ego, that really does think about things as part of itself. So that's number one. Number two, we'd have to include in this conversation that language itself gets a word in edgewise. When a writer sits down to write, it's not just between the writer's brain and the piece of paper. It's the writer's imagination, the writer's ego, and language. And language itself grows out of myth and metaphor. So you start tinkering around with words long enough, what you're going to find is those words start talking back to you. And this is exactly what Toni Morrison says in the preface of this novel, that she used to think that was a bunch of baloney. But in this novel, all of a sudden, the words started talking to her. And that's what I want to say when we say, could a writer know all those things? It's not up to the writer to know all those things. It's up to a writer to work with words. And when a writer starts working with words, the way a potter starts working with clay, those words are going to start suggesting shapes that the writer does not have control over, just the way you only have so much control over clay. Clay will only do ultimately what clay will do. And I'm suggesting that's the same thing with words. You see what I mean? You could start out on the first draft and not have an idea, have very little knowledge of all of these things that ended up in the novel. But by the time you got to the last draft, you would have been in deep conversation with language. And that language would have led you to be aware of connections that you weren't aware of initially. This is exactly what Toni Morrison says in the preface of the book. Go ahead, Julie.
So I've been thinking about this a lot. So you and I have talked about that before. I don't know if in podcasts or just, and we've talked about that piece. And I think that's fascinating. But what I also think is fascinating is, and I think this is what you've been trying to get across the whole time, is that the reader does that too, to an extent.
Wonderful.
And so, because, and I think that's why I find my job fascinating, in the sense that, yes, high literature is wonderful, but I also think graphic novels are great. And I'm currently rereading a series of books that I picked up the first time just for a fun, easy read. And as I'm rereading them, now that you and I have had all these conversations, I'm seeing things in this fantasy novel trilogy that I think I feel like the author is brilliant. Like, they are bringing up things about and connections between the idea of a story, and that a story has a soul, and that the authors get, and and that's just all part of the story. But as I'm rereading it, now that we've had all these conversations, I'm picking up on things that, like, I keep having to stop myself and write down notes and go back and read it again. And this is so it's not only the author having to get out of the way of their ego to write the book, but the reader then also has to get out of their way of their ego to understand it. All of a sudden you start seeing things that you didn't see before.
I think that is brilliant. That's the same imagination that writes novels or what reads novels. And at a certain point, our imaginations are wedded. Okay, all our egos are isolated, but our imaginations are a body of bodies. So this is why we can understand each other in these, when we use myth and metaphor, we're speaking the same language because we share a body. So we get a lot of things. So I think that's really a wonderful idea, that reading, if you think of it as a discipline and an art, is not entirely unlike what meditation is for people who have spiritual practices. What's the point of yoga? It really isn't so that you look good after you had a baby or whatever that men do for vanity reasons for yoga. The real reason of yoga comes from the word to yoke an ox to a cart. And we're talking about bridges and bonding. You're yoking consciousness really to your subconscious or your body, right? This is what the breath of yoga is doing. You're getting your body and your breath all integrated. You're becoming one. And not only are you becoming one with your own body, because tat devamasi, or thou art that, or when you do like this, what is deepest in me, Atman, is also the same thing that is the uncreated source of the universe, or Brahman. So you're yoking Atman, the deepest part of my identity, with the rest of existence. This is a bridging too. So I want to say that there is a way, this whole point that Julie instigated was that reading can be an art and discipline that leads to the transformation of consciousness, just like a spiritual practice. And that doesn't mean that it has to become religious. Mm-hmm. This is why reading for life is not really just tongue in cheek. There's a sense in which you're reading for the life of your imagination and struggling for existence with an ego that's going to lead you to the top of the mutual life building and leave you free falling because there ain't nothing up there. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But you can see where this could wig some religions out too. This is why it's not a religion. This is not like secretly a religion. This is about the imagination. And I'm not saying that it's a substitute for religion, but it has its own particular aspiration related to the liberation of our being. But in this sense, liberation includes the body in it. You see what I mean? You don't get free by disappearing from your body. And this is why the Song of Songs is such an important book of the Bible, really. I mean, Song of Songs is like saying the Holy of Holies. And for some rabbis, this is the holiest book of the Bible because it is reinforcing what the very notion of incarnation means, right? If God incarnates in man, that means God is becoming a human body. Okay, there could be no greater affirmation of the human body than a God that becomes, and the resurrection is a resurrection of the body. In other words, I'm saying that in this tradition, even though historically it's been wigged out about the body and has made everything about the body sin, the deep mythological foundation of this Christianity and Judaism and Islam, the Abrahamic religions, are absolutely invested in the body reintegrating itself into community that is not a pyramid. When people walk around the Kaaba, okay, for the hajj, when they go to Mecca during Ramadan and they walk around the Kaaba, they walk counterclockwise and everyone wears the same white garment. They're walking counterclockwise because that's a reversal of temporal time. It's a symbol of eternity. They're reversing clock time, and they're all wearing white garments because when you, in Allah's eyes, there is no king and there is no slave. Everyone is of equal status. So I'm suggesting even in that symbolic movement, what you see is the integration of the body. What was Muhammad attempting partly to do? To integrate so many different tribes that were killing each other into a super tribe that wasn't killing itself. You see what I mean? That these spiritual traditions are trying to build a body of bodies in which pyramids are in status hierarchies, which is basically to say different classes, is not the prevailing structure. Mm. And in literature doesn't, and this is to make a second Julie's point, literature doesn't know anything about high or low. Those are ego distinctions. Words don't know anything about that. Words know something about life and death, but they don't know anything about high and low. That's what the ego sort of makes. So you will find in works of literature that considered high literature, James Joyce, working with the same myths that you'll find in graphic novels. There's no other thing to work with. If you tried to spell letters without working with the alphabet, you would not come up with unique words. You see what I mean? If you said, you know what, I'm tired of all these words being alphabetical. I'm just sick of it. It feels too homogenous. I feel like the man is keeping me down because I have to use the alphabet. So I'm going to quit using the alphabet and I'm just going to make up my own language. Okay, great. But the downside of that is nobody's going to know what the hell you're talking about. So I'm suggesting the fact that literature comes out of a common sort of desire is not the same thing as everything becoming homogenized. The alphabet enables diversity of words. And the spirit enables a diversity of you could say individuality. You know, the more, and in other words, the more integrated I am with the body, paradoxically, the more uniquely I am myself. You see what I mean? The more uniquely, the more uniquely I am a brother, the more deeply I'm wedded with my sister. You see, I'm not a unique brother if I don't really have siblings. The more I'm more uniqueness as a spouse, the more I'm wedded to my spouse. These are not contradictory, because we're talking about a mode of consciousness now in which those either ors are no longer meaningful. So in the ego world, only way I can be unique is if I'm completely different than you. But that's not the logic of the spiritual world. It's a whole different logic. It's not the logic of love. That's the logic of ego. And you could say the Song of Solomon really has given us two different kingdoms. One that's very visible because it's the North Carolina Mutual Life building in the entire white world that the doctor and the milk and make and dad are trying to move up in. Okay, that's the one kingdom. We could call it the kingdom of moving on up. It also offers us less visibly another kingdom, and that's the kingdom symbolized in Shalimar, Virginia, of a community and people which, as Reverend Cooper says, I know everybody here. Mm-hmm. And that's the opposite. You can see the contrast between the where the novel begins with that big building in a hospital that doesn't allow Black people in, to compare that society with Shalimar, Virginia at the second half of the novel. And there you have it. The second half of the novel is a very different kind of kingdom. And why is everybody named Solomon? Because Solomon is the word for king in Song of Songs. In other words, there is a king, there's a kind of kingship that doesn't involve moving up. And we can all be a part of that kingdom. And the head of that kingdom is not an emperor or a pope or a dictator or even an old man that's with a white beard that sits on a throne. And you could say the head of that kingdom is the spirit that moves in and between us. Do you see what I mean? What unites us is not above us like a Pharaoh. What unites us is this love that is between us. This is a very, very radical vision. And this is why the library is potentially the most explosive institution in any society, including a democracy. It's also why a lot of English, if I want to, start I don't want to pick a fight here, but a lot of what's taught for English literature, not intentionally, is anything but what I'm talking about. Because if you started talking about this too deeply and the students in your class got fired up too much, you would cause an issue. And it wouldn't be because you were celebrating smoking dope or saying things that seem to be anti-American. You'd be saying things that seem to be, well, you might seem anti-American, I don't know, but you wouldn't be doing things that were immoral. You would be doing things that the social structure just doesn't want people to be conscious of, because the social structure is ultimately a pyramid, and a pyramid is not interested in talk that would lead to people walking out of the pyramid. And when I say a revolution, I don't mean going throwing bricks to a building. I mean walking out of a pyramid is an act of defiance. You see what I mean? You don't have to tear a pyramid down with a pickaxe. You just, since you're the bricks in it, you just pick up your legs and walk your little brick right out of the pyramid. And if everybody walks their brick out of the pyramid, there ain't no pyramid. This is why poets are dangerous to dictators. But I'm suggesting that all works of literature is a call to move to a different kind of kingdom in which stories, instead of propaganda, are the medium of self-knowledge. We learn who we are through the story. This is why it's the Song of Songs too. Milkman learns who he is not through the newspaper or not through political rallies. Milkman learns who he is through a song. And this is symbolic of the arts. Do you see what I mean? He learns his identity through a work of art, through a song, not through what they were teaching him in school. Do you see what I mean? This is what makes poets dangerous. They let loose a song that if people hear it, they'll wake up to who they really are.
So in his journey back to his earlier family history, when he was encountering people along the way, I think one of the things that it was like I was watching him sort of trying to figure it out, that he didn't have to be in this hierarchical weird thing where he was on top. Like the guy who picked him up, gave him a ride, he offered him a Coke and he wanted to pay for it. And the man was so insulted by that.
Wonderful. You just nailed it. That's it. Because in this kingdom, our relationships aren't transactional.
And yet what gets guitar chasing him is his open and free offer of help to load those things onto the train that he was.
Oh, good. See, you're a real reader, Linda. Those are absolutely emblematic moments, because the novel itself, right, calls attention to how unlike this was for Milkman, which is why Guitar didn't believe him. So you're identifying very subtle moments that are revelatory of two different kinds of consciousness. What those are moments when the ego consciousness gets displaced or gets exposed. Reading is a wonderful, revolutionary thing. And real quick, as we're wrapping up our closure here, a key thing of this novel is why does Pilate not have a navel?
Yeah.
This is a big deal. And a second thing related to that is Pilate's insistence that death is unnatural. Okay, if there was ever anything we would take to be natural, it would be death. But Pilate insists two things. One, it's not natural, and that nobody has to die. This is a big deal for Pilate. So let's see if we can connect the dots here. What Circe says, and Circe incidentally is the name in the Odysseus of the witch who turns men into pigs, which should probably be a little bit of a nudge to us that maybe those dogs are the butlers. Maybe those dogs are the white people. You see what I mean? If Circe's a witch, and as Reverend Cooper says, don't worry, Circe's taking care of everything. It's very likely, I'm just saying in a playful way, that those why is all that stuff about the dogs humming? Why does she keep talking about that? And my guess is that this is the fact that she's turned these people into dogs. But the point would be that they were always lived like dogs in the first place. They hunted down. The bobcat gets metaphorically identified with milkman. So when they're skinning that bobcat, milkman starts to see himself in the bobcat. He starts to see every black man in the bobcat. Okay, of these things being ripped away. Everybody wants this body. Okay, so there's playfully something going on with cats and dogs here. In any case, that the point I want to make is that Circe suggests that she's Circe's midwife. She said, I didn't birth Pilate. She born herself. Okay, so we know that biologically, Pilate didn't born herself. However, if we take into consideration that Pilate reborn herself, okay, when she decides that she's going to live a different way, and she doesn't know how to go about this new life, but she's going to basically forget everything she's learned and then ask herself 2 questions or 3 questions, I suppose. What makes me happy? What makes me sad? And what is the difference? Try to drop all of the heady stuff that I've said, seriously. And this is just my 2 bits. I don't want to tell you how to read, but my 2 bits. And instead of thinking anything that's metaphysical or philosophical or theological or psychological, let all that go and pay attention to the words. Imagine, for instance, the milkman paying attention to the hunt. In other words, you don't forget big words. Pay attention to how the words are talking to each other. Try to hear this language before language, and don't think about anything philosophical. That stuff gets in the way. I'm just unpacking that stuff so that, because it's implicit, but that won't help you read either. The way to learn to read is to pay attention to those words, because they're communicating at multiple levels. Every one of those words there's a reason for it. And if you keep your eye on that, and it'll be particular to every novel, right? This novel, all of a sudden everybody's named Solomon. Why is that? Well, that's a hint that there's something about kingship going on here, and it's the Song of Songs. I'm paying attention to the title. In other words, if we pay attention to the words will lead you to the profundity. If we let go of the words and try to be profound, we will find ourselves in abstractions, and we will lose touch with the novel. Anytime you take your eye off the image, you fall into abstractions, and abstractions is how the head talks. The body talks with images. So I just want to throw that out there, that if there's one thing you get from this, I hope it's not a philosophy or a theory. It's that pay attention to words, because they're speaking at different depths of significance. And at one depth, they're connecting with each other. They're bonding with each other. That's what you really want to keep an eye on. How are these words bonding with each other?
Wonderful. What a great way to conclude the podcast. There's your homework for starting our next novel, Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. As you're doing your reading, don't worry about the heady stuff. Consider how the words are bonding with each other. Thank you, Michael and Linda, for the great conversation today. And thank you, listeners, for joining us. Until next time, this is the Reading for Life podcast, signing off.